As I continue my reading of the Bible verse by verse at Genesis chapter 16, let's catch up with Abraham. When last we met him, he had just chased up country with his private army to smite some foreigners who had been troubling the locals. Of course, Abraham himself was a foreigner, and he fully intended to wipe the locals off the face of the earth. But that's not the point. Abraham was on a mission from God. Not when he was chasing after Chedorlaomer and his mates, of course. That was just a private mission to save his nephew Lot. The same Lot who, a few pages from now, will sleep with both his daughters. And having watched this transpire from above, the good Lord immediately reaffirmed his covenant with Abraham, adding a few conditions to the contract. Now we continue as Abraham, the warmonger, gets his slave pregnant. I wonder why it is that Southern Republicans are so keen for a return to good old biblical values. Genesis chapter 16. Abraham is 85 at the start of chapter 16. If you know any 85-year-old men, keep that picture in your mind as we continue. Now, Sarah cannot get pregnant. They've been trying a while. IVF isn't available, and God's going to wait another 15 years before he intervenes. So Sarah decides to take things into her own hands, or rather into her slave's vagina. There are a couple of apologist excuses for this. The first is that Hagar was not a slave. That idea is so laughable, I'll end the discussion there. The second is that this was the societal norm, and we should not judge it by today's ethical standards. This is at least an argument, but still a ridiculous one. According to these same apologists, we don't decide the ethical standard. God does. Here's an idea. When God said, "Abraham, leave this well-watered land of Mesopotamia and come live in the famine-ridden desert where you can fight the natives in a land grab for the rest of recorded history," why didn't he add a simple rule? "Oh, Abraham, and no more slaves, okay?" But no, God will make Abraham perform multiple animal sacrifices, mutilate himself and all the males in his tribe, and even perform a fake sacrifice of his son. Hoop after hoop Abraham will jump through, with barely a pause for thought. Do you think that telling him it was wrong to treat people as objects to be bought and sold and treated no better than cattle would have been too much to ask for? Bearing always in mind that his omniscient self would supposedly be fully aware of the future implications of not only allowing slavery to continue, but fully rewarding the product of slavery. So Sarah gives her slave to Abraham and tells him to rape her. Having been raped by this 85-year-old man, Hagar discovers that she is pregnant and understandably holds this against Sarah. "How dare the bitch get upset with me just because I let my 85-year-old husband rape her and get her pregnant," bemoans Sarah. "I don't give a shit," says Abraham. "I had my fun. Do what you want with her." Okay, so I paraphrase. But consider that we are meant to believe that Abraham was after a son and heir, and that he had come to Canaan on a promise from God, that God had told Abraham that his son's line would inherit everything from the Nile to the Euphrates, and that this was why at the age of 85 he had decided that the only way he could achieve all of this was through Hagar. After all of that, he supposedly says to Sarah, "Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee." To me that seems a bit of a limp response. This maid was supposedly carrying the future of God's covenant. And all through Abram's story, we have him setting up altars and holding God barbecues. And I think he meets up with the big I Am more than any other person in the Bible. So why, throughout this entire Hagar episode, didn't he once think to ask the big cheese for some advice and guidance? Or you might ask yourself, why didn't the big I Am intervene, as he is about to do? Sarah dealt hardly with Hagar, and Hagar ran off. It doesn't say what Sarah did, but as Hagar's default position was slave, dealt hardly, we can assume was something we would not want to endure. So for 10 to 15 years after being told that his heirs would inherit the promised land, Abraham had no luck getting his wife pregnant. His wife suggests that he use one of her slaves as a surrogate mother. Abraham rapes Hagar. Hagar finds out she's pregnant and despises Sarah. Sarah gets fed up with this and moans to Abraham. Abraham washes his hands of the deal. Hagar gets the shitty end of the stick until she can take no more, and finally, jobless, worthless, shamed, sullied and pregnant, she runs away into the desert. And finally, God intervenes and tells Hagar to go back and take whatever Sarah decides to mete out to her. Oh, but that's not all. God also tells her that the unborn son she is carrying will be a wild ass of a man who will fight everyone and be fought with by everyone, including his relatives. Nothing like sweetening the pill, is there? Abraham won't get to see God for another 14 years. Genesis chapter 17. So Abraham's 99 when God comes back and says, "Walk with me, Abraham, and I will make a covenant between me and thee." And Abraham fell on his face. I think this is a mistranslation and should read, Abraham's jaw hit the floor. Hadn't he already made a covenant with God a page ago, signed and sealed in goat's blood? But God pulls a fast one here. He changes Abram's name to Abraham and Sarah's name to Sarah. In one fell swoop, the original contract is null and void. God tears it up. That old contract was with Abram, my boy. I don't know any Abram, do you? Abraham? It's no skin off my nose, says Abraham. Funny you should mention that, says God. Here's the new deal. Every male in your household, over 8 days old, has to lose the end of his knob. Why, says Abraham? As a sign that you all have faith. But don't you already know what we are all thinking, says Abraham. I'm omniscient, booms God. So, any overt physical proclamation which in no way provides proof of a personal commitment is pointless as well as meaningless. And the idea that an 8-day-old child is in any position to make a commitment one way or another is utterly absurd. Shut it and get your todger out. Okay, so I drifted slightly away from the authorised King James Version there. Then Abraham falls on his face again and laughs. I suspect he was forcing back tears. God has just told him that he will have another child, this time with Sarah. Now Sarah is 90, and she might have appealed to the Egyptian dusty mummy worshippers when she was 75, but the idea of the future of Israel, depending on these two, before the invention of Viagra and KY jelly, would have me joining Abraham rolling on the floor. So God tells Abraham that Ishmael will father 12 tribes, but that his son with Sarah, to be called Isaac, will be the one God makes a covenant with. Hang on, didn't God just make a covenant again with me, thinks Abraham? And then God tells Abraham the exact day on which Isaac will be born. Now, if you were Abraham, you might get to thinking that if God has been in control of Sarah's fertility all this time, why didn't he just let her conceive way back when and avoid all this heartache for them both, and of course Hagar? But to be honest, having read Genesis, if you were Abraham, then thinking would probably not be your strongest suit. That's it for today. Voice is giving up. Thanks for listening. Oh, and please add me on Google and Twitter if you want to.